Now we come to the most difficult problem in all of life. Not just Christian life, but all of life. Everyone grapples with this problem, the problem of evil. In this lecture, I'd like to define just some of the set up the problem. What are the parameters? What are the terms? What are some of the responses that are offered? And then next week, we'll get into what I think we must say, what we should say about the problem of evil. So first, to set up the problem, you should know there are two kinds of evil. There's natural evil and there's moral evil. Natural would be hurricanes, tsunamis, tornadoes, earthquakes, cancer. These are truly evils, but they're not done by anyone. They're part of nature. Moral evil is evil performed by an agent, such as sin. So these are two different kinds of evil, but I believe that natural evil exists because of moral evil. If there hadn't been a fall, there wouldn't be cancer and death and hurricanes wiping out coastlines. I also believe that moral evil can exacerbate natural evil. A morally deficient builder who builds shoddy houses on the coastline, well, when that tsunami or hurricane comes through, more people will die, more houses will fall. If the airplane mechanic is lazy and doesn't tighten up all the bolts quite right, when that airplane hits turbulence, it'll shake more. So these are two different kinds of evil, but we have natural evil, I believe, because of moral evil, and moral evil can make natural evil worse. You should also know there are two forms of the problem of evil. The first one is the existential religious question, and this is where most people struggle. And in class, I'd like to hear from you, from your wisdom, from your experience. How do you help people who are struggling with, I just learned that I have cancer, or my husband just had an affair, or my wife just left me, or my child was in a terrible car accident? Right? How do you help people who are struggling with the why me question? Where is God? Why isn't he caring for me better? That religious existential question. We will spend most of our time, though, talking about the logical, the philosophical setup of the problem, not because that's where most people struggle, but we are a school and we can talk about the philosophical thing easier in a school setting. It's simply this. If God is omnibenevolent, if God is all good, and God is omnipotent, God is all powerful, there shouldn't be evil. If God is all good, he wouldn't want there to be evil. If God is all powerful, he would stop it. But there is evil. So which is it? Is God either not all good or is God not all powerful? That's that logical, philosophical problem of evil. A couple other introductory ideas. The big issue with evil is what we call gratuitous evil. Gratuitous means needless, unnecessary. Some evils we think are worth it because of the outcome. So if you need a hip replacement, right, you might allow there to be evil done to you. They cut into your body, they cut into the bone, and you have several weeks of rehab. You will hurt. There'll be suffering. It's evil, but it's worth it because you'll get a new hip. So some evils, some suffering, we think it's worth going through. We can see how it will make things better in the end. But there's so much needless evil in this world. It's one thing for Nazis to kill Jews. That's terrible. But did they have to be so artistic and so cruel? Did they have to make Sophie choose which child lives? Right? So much needless suffering. It's one thing to suffer from cancer, and maybe as you're dying, maybe it can form your character, but so much pain, every last moan, every last pang of sharp pain, is that somehow all of that necessary? There's so much gratuitous evil in this world that's really hard to imagine how all of it, each aspect, each act of evil, each wince of pain is somehow necessary or somehow contributes to some greater good. You also should know there's a difference between what we call a defense and a theodicy. A theodicy is where someone says, here is the reason. I have the actual answer. I know why there's evil, why God allowed it, why God decreed it. I know why there's evil. Be very careful. Grab your wallet when someone says they have the actual answer for the problem of evil. A defense is much more circumspect, careful, restrained. A defense says, I'm not saying I have the answer. I'm not saying I figured it out, but here's a possibility. Here's a way that there could be an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God and evil. So defense is, I think, a better way to go. We're not saying we figured it out, but we're saying here's one way we can defend God's existence and God's goodness and God's power, even in the face of evil. And then lastly, before we get into the different strategies, my professor Richard Muller, in my doctoral program at Calvin, he had a really good line. He said, you have to decide right off the bat, are you going to have a God problem or an evil problem? Right? If God is all good and all powerful, you struggle then with, why is there evil? Well, it's tempting. No one's going to loosen up God's goodness, because if God's not good, why would you worship him? But it's tempting to soften God's power, to say, well, maybe God has less power than we thought. If you loosen God's power, you might create enough space to explain how evil got through. So, now you explained evil, but don't you have a worse problem? Maybe now you have a God problem, a God who's not entirely powerful. So for my money, I'd rather have a full-on, entirely good God and a full-on, entirely powerful God, and allow evil to be the problem. I want to wrestle with the problem of evil. That's where the mystery lies. I don't want to soften up God's power to make room for evil. And now I maybe can explain how evil got here, but now I don't have a worse problem. A God who really wants to stop evil, but just couldn't do it. So it's good to ask before we get into the strategies, will you have a God problem or an evil problem? And I encourage you to keep it as an evil problem and not end up, not solve the problem of evil and create a bigger problem in the process. So what are some strategies? What are some arguments people have used to explain why there can be an all-good, all-powerful God and also evil? Well, the first one, and all of these will defend God's goodness, different attempts to defend God's goodness. Then we'll talk about one that discusses God's power. But how can God be good if there's evil? Well, the first one comes from Leibniz, a modern British philosopher, who said, this world, if God is the greatest possible being, right, then this greatest possible being should have created the greatest possible world. So whatever this world is, everything in this world and all the events that happened somehow contribute to making this a better world than it otherwise would be. So one less squirrel getting eaten by a wolf, one less cancer, one less pang of cancer would make this world a little bit less good. So all of the evil in this world is put here by God to make this world the best possible world. Now this is a highly presuppositional argument, right? Leibniz is assuming that God must make the best possible world. But as Alvin Plantinga has said in response, he called it Leibniz's lapse. He said, but why would you say God is required to make the best possible world? Is it even possible, right? Couldn't God always add another angel to this world? Angels are good, right? Wouldn't adding another angel make this world better than it already is? So is it even possible for God to make the greatest possible world? It's also, I think, very hard to do justice to great tragedies. Someone who does like this argument is John Piper, and sometimes he is quick in response to real tragedies to say, well, God did it. because he believes that all of these evils are necessary to make this the best possible world. So, for instance, when that bridge collapsed in Minneapolis and a couple cars fell into the river, uh, John Piper said that God loosened the bolts and took down the bridge. When that plane crashed in the Hudson, he wrote that, you know how hard it is to crash a plane with geese? God aimed those geese at the engine at just the right angle, like laser guided missiles, to take down the plane. So I appreciate John Piper. I love his view of God's sovereignty. But when tragedies happen, I believe God's in charge of it all. But I don't know what God's doing in this. It's a mystery. What I do know, what's been revealed to me, is that in a fallen world, bridges collapse. In a fallen world, planes crash. So I think we're better off when tragedies happen, not to just say, well, God did it, but to not minimize God's sovereignty, but talk about what's been revealed. These things happen in a fallen world, and we mourn, we lament with those who are suffering. So, best possible world is one attempt, and it would strike most people as harsh, perhaps even tone deaf. When people are grieving a great tragedy, to say, well, God did it. Now, in Piper's defense, he's saying it's actually a great comforting to know that it's a great comfort to know that God's in charge. And so, in his mind, it's very comforting, and I think we can emphasize God's sovereignty, not back that off, but emphasize. Well, we'll see. I wouldn't say God did it, as we'll see next week. I think that's too. It makes God culpable for the evil. So I don't want to minimize God's sovereignty, but I do want to say what's been revealed to us is we live in a fallen world, and tragic things happen in a fallen world. But that's one attempt, best possible world. Second is called soul making, and this comes from Irenaeus, 2nd century, the very first theologian after the Bible in the history of the church. Irenaeus, a 2nd century theologian. And this view is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So some evil, you endure it, you suffer, and you come out stronger in the end. And again, there's truth in this one because say you have a child that has some kind of handicap and you know they may be teased at school and it breaks your heart. You want to shelter them, you want to protect them from bullies, but you also know that in the end, they could come out stronger from having endured this suffering. So there is something to this, right? Our souls become stronger through suffering, and yet there's so much gratuitous evil, so much needless suffering that it's hard to imagine how that contributes to making us a stronger, better person. The next one comes from Augustine, and this is called Plenitude of Being. And this is not very persuasive to me. It's the idea that God could have made a world of just angels, of just unfallen angels, just the top of the chain of being. But God likes variety. God likes the spice of life. And so God made the entire chain of being. Angels at the top, and then humans, and then dolphins, and then dogs, and then cats, and then plants, and then rocks. He likes the whole variety of life. Well, variety means creating creatures that are not just immutably righteous, but creatures that are mutable, creatures that are changeable, creatures that could go bad. And since creatures that could go bad likely would, that's why there's evil. So why is there evil? Because God likes variety. God created creatures, free creatures, that could go bad, because that's more variety than creating free creatures who would never sin. And since they could go bad, and they did, that's why there's evil. So, not terribly persuasive to me, because I'm a Calvinist, and I believe that God could create genuinely free creatures that never go bad. I think he will do that on the new earth. That's glorification. If he can do that then, why couldn't he do that now? Why couldn't he do that from the very start? Another option, again from Augustine, this is called contrast. And this is evil provides a contrast to good. You wouldn't appreciate goodness so much if you had not encountered evil. So evil helps you appreciate the good. And again, this is true to some extent, but we know it can't be the answer because God is good and God knows he's good. And God knew he was good before there was evil. So God does not need evil to understand his own goodness. Uh, so you don't need evil actually to appreciate goodness. In fact, God, who's eternal, he's always been good. God predates evil. Goodness was here before there was evil, and goodness will be here long after evil is gone. So Augustine elsewhere, he does call evil a privatio boni, a privation of the good. Evil is a corruption of a good. It's the absence of good. It's a good gone astray. This actually is a very important insight. Evil cannot stand on its own 2 feet. Evil must piggyback on what is already good. Take the devil. How do you get Satan? Only if you start with Lucifer. Augustine said, whatever has measure, form, and order. It has measure. It has size. It has form. It's identified as a thing, and it's ordered. It's arranged in a certain way. Measure, form, and order. These are all ontological goods, and Lucifer had the greatest amount of them. He was perhaps the greatest angel God ever made. He was smarter than his mind. His intellect was smarter than yours and mine. And he was so high, so good, that when he rejected God, when he turned against God, he became just that much more evil. But if he wasn't already good and a very high good, he could not have become a great evil. Evil can only corrupt a prior underlying good. So evil is like rust on a car, right? Rust is the evil, and the metal is the good. And the more rust you have, the more evil and the less good. But if your rust continues to grow until it completely engulfs your car, there's no more car, but there's also no more rust. Rust can't exist without an underlying metal. And so evil can't exist without an underlying good. And that's how we know we know for sure because of God, but just logically, how we know that evil cannot win. Because if evil did ever completely defeat goodness, it would destroy itself. Evil is a suicide mission. So goodness must predate evil. It was here before evil, it will be here long after it's gone. We don't need evil, actually, to appreciate or understand goodness. So these are attempts, some of them say more than others, but they're attempts to try to defend God's goodness in the face of evil. There's one big argument that I think softens God's power to make room for evil, and this comes from Alvin Plantinga in his book God, Freedom, and Evil, and it's called The Free Will Defense. So Plantinga has given it the most philosophical sophistication, but it's something that you hear all the time in church. It's the most common evangelical argument for evil. It goes like this. Why is there evil? Well, God gave us free choice. Why did he give us free choice? Well, because God wanted us to love him, and robots can't love. So God gave us freedom in the hopes that we would love him. But if he gave us real freedom, then he can't control what we do with that freedom. He gave us freedom so that we would love him, but he can't stop us from using that freedom to reject him and sin and rebel. So why is there evil? Because God gave us freedom, hoping we would love him, and we used it for bad. As Plantinga describes it, he says, it just may be the case, this is why it's called a defense, it may be the case that we possess trans-world depravity, which sounds like a really bad airline. Do not fly. Trans-world depravity. Trans-world depravity means that in every possible world that God could ever create, we would eventually go bad. So it's not God's fault that we possess trans-world depravity. It's just in every world that would ever be made, we would eventually use our freedom to reject him. So it's on us. It's our fault that we possess trans-world depravity. It's not God's fault. He gave us freedom, and it just may be the case that we would always eventually reject him. So this is, again, a very popular defense for the problem of evil, and it says something really important. It's true that it's our fault. It's true. We did use our freedom to reject God. That is absolutely true. But as a Calvinist, and if you're a Calvinist, you can't actually agree with this argument completely, and here's why. The argument assumes that there's something God cannot do. The argument assumes that God cannot guarantee what free creatures freely do with their freedom. Let me say that again. The argument assumes God cannot guarantee what free creatures freely do with their freedom. Once God gave us freedom, now his hands are off. It's up to us. He can encourage us to do what's right, but he cannot guarantee it. Well, Calvinists say, well, that's just not true. God can, in some mysterious way, God can give me genuine freedom and yet guarantee what I do with that freedom. I believe that happened at regeneration. God did not compromise my freedom, but he changed my will. He changed my heart so I would freely come to him and freely repent and believe. And I believe in glorification, at the end of my salvation, he will confirm me in righteousness. I won't just be a robot doing whatever he makes me do. I will freely want to do what's right, and it will be because of him. So if God can guarantee what I freely do at regeneration and in glorification, then why can't he do that with everyone all the time? So this is the most popular free will defense, the most popular argument about evil. If you're an Arminian, I think it could work for you. If you're a Calvinist, it just wouldn't. Again, it says something important, but it doesn't solve the problem. And going back to the Richard Muller comment, I would just urge you to think about this. Has this defense, quote, solved the problem of evil, but now raised up an even bigger problem, a God problem? Because now there's something even God can't do. Isn't there a big cost to say, even God can't guarantee what I do with my freedom? That, to me, that's a very big concession. So these are attempts to explain how there can be God in evil. Next week, we'll talk about what I think are better answers, more satisfying answers for God in the problem of evil.